Television is regulated. That should come as no surprise. In fact, we could probably argue that television is one of the most regulated visual products that we have. In part, this is due to the nature and position of television. Television is not cinema. It is not consumed in a theater. You don't have to leave the room. You don't have to purchase a ticket to see the film. Rather, it is a private activity, usually consumed in a private space. However, it also sits right on the precipice between private and public. It's rather a key tool of connecting public and private spaces with one another. As such, watching television might be a private activity, that is very true, but it is also an activity that translates and transmits public debates and discussions into the domestic sphere. However, we have to keep in mind that nowadays the private sphere is very much not closed off as it was years, decades, centuries ago, as other media intrude into this space and into this sphere. While Giblett noted as late as 2008 that household members would not be able to directly communicate with members on the outside during a program unless they were using a telephone, he made this argument well before live tweeting shows and events, as well as instant access to other social actors by the help of social media, became more common. And thus, instead of being a strictly segmented space, the onset of different communication media has rendered the domestic sphere semi-permeable. Due to this semi-public, semi-private nature and the fact that television is generally accessible to everyone who owns a set, television is heavily policed and regulated because its intended audience isn't just adults, but also, for instance, children or vulnerable people. In the following, I will briefly introduce some of the regulation mechanisms that television adheres to. First, we're going to address John Reith's ethos, what British broadcasting should be, something which I've briefly hinted at in the other video, which I will link somewhere here or here. I'm not quite sure which side it is, but it is somewhere up there in the corner. Secondly, we will have a look at the more vague idea of class tastes and morality which governs most of television. And lastly, we are going to have a look at the legal document and the legal basis of British broadcasting, that is the Royal Charter for Broadcasting. In the late 1920s, the first general manager of the BBC, John Reith, stressed that the BBC's main goals should be to adhere to quality broadcasting, claiming that its purpose and that of broadcasting in general should be to inform, to educate, and to entertain. Notably, the function to entertain takes a backseat in contrast to the BBC's role as an educational and an informational tool, a tendency that is still found in the Royal Charter that determines the BBC's mission and purpose, in which both imparting impartial information and its educational function are named before and expounded in more detail in comparison to its entertainment purpose. While John Reith's statement was only leveled at radio broadcasts, these standards were carried over to television broadcasting, which was to be structured along the same lines, with information and education taking precedence to entertainment. The BBC's attitude to entertainment was and has been, as Paul Allen Taylor notes, governed by the fact that broadcasting is part of the domestic life of the nation. Thus, standards of taste were far more paternalistic and rigid than those operating elsewhere, for instance in music halls in the 1920s or the cinema later on. While such standards are still anchored in the BBC's mission statement, it seems safe to assume that instead of being sidelined in favor of more serious functions, entertainment has certainly become equal to television's function as an informational and educational tool. Even nowadays, the BBC's mission statement reads as a call to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high quality and distinctive output and services which inform, educate and entertain. However, this ethos, while certainly an influence in the early days of the BBC and to an extent nowadays, is only a slight regulatory influence in comparison to others. Another form of regulation that I want to address is far less tangible and far more complex and also far more problematic. Andrew Criswell notes that one notion to which the BBC broadly subscribed was that democracy consists of giving all the people what they want. But this is, of course, undemocratic in the sense that broadcasting was limited and people had and have different tastes, and thus nobody gets enough of what they actually want. The second notion to which many of the corporation's critics subscribed was that democracy consists of giving the majority of people what it wants, which is also undemocratic, positively despotic even, in the sense that the minority gets absolutely nothing at all. The complaint against the BBC then was that the majority did not get enough of what it wanted and a great deal of what it did not want. This, in a way, ties in with matters of class and taste. The BBC had for a long time been faced with criticisms about its elitist nature, because the BBC's public service policy was to try and provide not just something for everyone, but the best of everything. And the best is a notoriously different concept, which is likely to cause a controversy not simply about the merits of programs, but within certain categories, but also about where those categories should be drawn. The same, of course, goes for notions of quality, which are very hard to frame comprehensively. In regards to music, for instance, classical music was favored by the BBC for broadcasting, with the assumption being that if you like music, you could not be displeased with Bach or Beethoven, and that if you liked theatre, you could also be not discontented with Shakespeare. But many listeners did not greatly care for these things and felt that the amount of airtime they occupied was not only undemocratic but elitist, in the sense that unlike programs about farming or sport, where the best derive from other criteria, programs of classical music or drama simply reflected the values of those at the higher end of the social scale. And the artistic and moral interests and values represented were largely upper and middle class. This is not necessarily surprising. After all, and please note the sarcasm here, where else should judgments about artistic and intellectual merit come from, if not from the most highly educated? Since these qualities generate wealth and are themselves sustained by it, where else would these people be found if not in the upper echelons of the social scale? But the corporation also held that there was no inherent connection between cultural values and social class. Given the opportunity, everyone, and not just the elite, could appreciate Bach and Shakespeare, and this opportunity to appreciate and consume high cultural products, the BBC was determined to provide. Hence, the aim of public service broadcasting was to give the public a better service than it had actually asked for. Reith himself was very and famously explicit on this. He said, "It is occasionally indicated to us that we are apparently setting out to give the public what we think they need, and not what they want. But few know what they want, and very few know what they actually need." While this is certainly patronizing from our current standpoint, we need to keep the pre-war era in mind, during which this statement was made, as most people during that pre-war time finished school at the age of 14, and only a minority of the population could undergo higher education. Hence, as Criswell states, there was much more consensus than there is today about what, in cultural terms, was good, significant, or worthwhile. What Reith and others are proposing is not so much that the BBC should address a universal want or preference, but that the BBC was to address universal, if at times unacknowledged, needs. For the aim was to open up to all those who had been denied them by a limited education, low social status, and small income, the great treasures of our culture. And of course, while class preferences were traceable in programming, Reith and the BBC were unable to completely be unresponsive to mass tastes. Reith's words might imply that the BBC did not broadcast a lot of light entertainment and popular music, But not doing so would have most likely led to more people simply switching off their receivers and thus to a loss in profit. The corporation therefore broadcast a fair amount of popular culture. For instance, according to figures it gave to the Ullswater Committee, it provided during 1934 nearly 3 times as much dance and light music as opposed to serious music. Nevertheless, the BBC was always ready to discriminate on the listener's behalf between the good and the inferior in popular culture, often on moral rather than aesthetic or intellectual grounds. As I've said in the last video, as well as in this one, the emphasis on the domestic and the family is still significant, because it implicitly influences not only the policing of the spectator, but also the representation of issues on screen, in particular of, for instance, violence, nakedness, and sexuality. While we could, of course, examine a number of issues here, I will focus on sexuality in particular, because most issues we'll be talking about can be appropriately examined via this example. Not only is television produced for and consumed in the domestic sphere, the spectre of the family has remained central to broadcasting and broadcasting policies. Censorship, for instance, was thus defined by the Annan Committee on Broadcasting as a necessity due to this family setting. People watch and listen in the family circle, so that violations of the taboos of language and behavior, which exist in every society, are witnessed by the whole family in each other's presence. These violations are more deeply embarrassing and upsetting than if they had occurred in the privacy of a book, or in a club, in a cinema, or a theatre. Thus, the ordinariness that seems to be a unique and potentially radical feature of television is also its greatest hindrance. With family being at the core of television, Jane Ethos argues that explicit representations of heterosexual activity, or even the mention of other more deviant sexual behaviors, were rendered completely unthinkable and certainly unportrayable. The visualization of sexuality, in particular nakedness and the physical act, is strictly regulated by family values, moral values, and ideas of taste. While sex certainly sells, this is only partially true for television. Rather than being mainly profitable, television in the UK was meant to improve the tastes of the masses and thereby encourage middle-class values and behavior. As such, visualizing sexuality was and is still a case of customization, with visualizations of sexuality being preferred that are being tailored to certain social groups in order to maximize their pleasure while minimizing the offense to other groups. As such, different genres, channels, and programs are structured by institutionalized distinctions in taste, as they are addressed to different segments of an audience. Taste in this vein is significant, as taste also governs the distinctions of quality and trash television. Sexuality and sex on screen has commonly been regarded as artless, tasteless, and trash. Thus, quality programs sought to portray as little sexuality and nakedness as possible, a rejection that has, as Ethos argues, led to a proliferation of sexual expressions elsewhere. In this field of struggle between the social values of a middle class, nuclear family, taste, and revenues, all of which in conjunction with the general idea that public service television should educate, inform, and entertain, visualizing sexuality is ordered hierarchically according to taste and class, as those classes which possess a high volume of economic capital and cultural capital are clearly in a stronger position to define what is legitimate, valid, and pure taste. As such, a sexually explicit but aesthetic art film could be shown uncut on BBC Two, but it would have to be cut for BBC One, for instance. According to Ethos, this implies that the kind of people who watch BBC Two actually have the cultural capital to appreciate art, which then again legitimizes the sex as culturally worthwhile. It is these distinctions of taste that affect the forms of sexual representation across genre and program lines. The negligence of visual expressions of sexuality on screen legitimizes the largely middle-class tastes of a potential audience, whereas other tastes and practices are marked as strange and other and therefore rejected or rendered invisible. Yet taste is not the only governing principle of sexual representations on screen. As in the UK, this quality threshold is maintained by the Broadcasting Standards Commission, which has now been replaced by Ofcom, that is the Office of Communications, which monitors standards of taste and decency and regulates any sexually explicit material. The regulation of sexual material is discussed in detail in Section 1 of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, a section titled Protecting the Under 18s. Moreover, sexuality and representing sexuality are briefly remarked upon under the rules of generally accepted standards, in particular under offensive material, which may include offensive language, violence, sex, sexual violence, humiliation, distress, violation of human dignity, discriminatory treatment, or language. According to the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, or the OBC, sexually explicit material rated R18 must not be broadcast at any time, the only exception being premium subscription service where adult content can only be shown from 10 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. While this pertains to sexually explicit content which operates under strict mandatory restricted access, representations of sexual intercourse are similarly segmented by a broadcasting schedule, and thus representations of sexual intercourse are usually preceded with a warning and must, and I quote, generally not occur before the watershed in case of television when content is likely to be accessed by children unless there is a serious educational purpose. Any discussion on or portrayal of sexual behavior must be editorially justified if included before the watershed and must be appropriately limited. There are a number of problems with this. First of all, what is considered to be adult material is not sufficiently specified. However, Ethos has argued that while regulation practices and law texts might be sometimes necessarily vague on the subject of what sexual acts actually constitute sex on screen, there are two guidelines that she outlines which separate aesthetic or appropriate displays of sexuality from those of pornography or indecent imaginary. As she notes, the display of the erect penis is still a taboo on television and in most films, leading to substitute phallic objects being used in its stead, both in order to signify sexual arousal and virility, as well as for more educational demonstrations. Furthermore, it is the preference for showing simulated penetrative sexual intercourse rather than real sexual intercourse on screen that is still the key boundary marker between softcore and hardcore sexual representation. Secondly, sexuality, intercourse, and their visualizations are considered to be potentially dangerous or at least harmful to children and should only be shown in an educational context, a trend that reinforces the idea that on the one hand, factual genres that inform and educate are regarded as intrinsically more worthwhile than fictional genres whose main purpose is to entertain. On the other hand, representing sex only as a part of an educational and informative program replicates the scientific bias that has informed a majority of sexology. Implicitly, this signifies that sex is still somewhat a visual taboo, a topic which can only be respectable and portrayable if it is couched in scientific or educational terms. Moreover, allusions to moral standards, decency, and good taste are still being made, as works which have redeeming literary, artistic, political, or scientific value can be categorized as indecent or rated higher according to the BBFC in order to be shown later. For children and young adults, this means a pedagogization of sex, a trend that comes with implications as to the role of sexuality as a whole. On the other hand, it implies that knowledge about sexuality is dangerous and, as Arthur argues, will potentially encourage children to experiment with sexuality prematurely. the latter of which is to be prevented at all costs by scheduling, content warnings, and rating systems. Additionally, concerns revolve around the idea that a normalization of sexual behavior and content available to children may influence their sexual development to a degree that they are left with sustained emotional overload, for instance, a premonition that seems problematic in the face of readily available indecent material online. While such concerns are widespread, not all of them are necessarily balanced or in some cases thoroughly investigated, something that might be attributed to the general reluctance that sex generates, as well as the still held assumption that children are somehow non-sexual beings that should not be confronted with sexual representations whatsoever. As such, concerns of access and the effects of television and visualizations of sexuality on the development of sexual citizenship are entirely normative. That is to say, oriented towards the prevention of deviant behavior and the promotion of traditional family values. Now, does that mean that television is absolutely 100% regulated and we are being fed lies and untruths like some would inevitably cry? Not quite. I mean, sure, we do consume premeditated messages, but TV is a very different animal than the internet, which to a large extent provides us with unmediated messages, at least not mediated to the extent that we see in television. This is why we're flooded with many sources for information, and with information that is not fact-checked and may be incongruent, information that may be confusing, or vital information that is buried under unnecessary information. Moreover, television does not and has never existed alone in the field of mass media. In the beginning, it was still seen as radio with pictures, and somewhat less trustworthy than radio or print media, and today it's comparatively slow in comparison to the rapid 24/7 nature of the internet. This, however, also means that television cannot not change, simply because there are so many other options, and television needs to remain competitive. The presence of a more diverse, less centralized, less publicly governed market that has appeared with the rise of streaming services and which directly challenges mainstream broadcasting has perhaps even made it necessary for television to shift towards different alternative narratives. For example, the third season of Netflix sitcom Grace and Frankie revolved around the two leads getting their vibrators for older women enterprise off the ground. This is a narrative line that is scarcely, if not to say never, to be found on television. Not only is this plotline not played for laughs by simply portraying it as a futile enterprise which fails, thus returning the leads to the status quo while simultaneously negating the significance of later life sexuality, but the business venture is actually treated as a valid choice for older women, which is not a very common thing to see on television or on screen in general. With such new markets, with new audiences and new potentials accessed by streaming services, television has had and will have to broaden its representations also. With this potential broadening, regulation mechanisms will also presumably change to adapt to these new developments. However, television, similar to other non-public broadcasting services, is still beholden to consumer interests. This means that only some identities, some sexual identities, some behaviors and practices are compatible with consumer interests. This results yet again in the invisibility of some identities, behaviors and practices, and creating new exclusions that disadvantage the poor, the disabled, the old, and those regarded as other. In conclusion, the regulation inherent in television, on the one hand, may help to further reinforce problematic or alternative portrayals on screen by rendering some of them visible and some of them invisible in the first place. By allotting space to different kinds of representations, television has taken over from traditional forms of authority as a cornerstone of good morality and morally good behavior. In effect, television retains a disciplinary function with regards to legitimate and illegitimate practices in that it shapes the way issues are viewed in the public sphere, enabling the formation of specific kinds of knowledges and specific kinds of citizenship. On the other hand, television is not only a potentially transformative medium, but a medium capable of transformation and change. With a greater emphasis on consumership, or as Arthur has argued, the citizen consumer, and economic considerations, the question arises, whose views will eventually prevail if television is governed by economic interests? Sie haben sich heute viel bewegt. Ja, ich habe ja auch mindestens schon eine Stunde hier rumgehampelt vom Mikrofon. Also, jetzt wo die Fitnessstudios zu sind, gilt jetzt also auch Unterrichten als Sport. Fantastisch! Semi-permeable? Permeable? Permeable? Permeable. This is... What? Instead of using super academic words, I could actually be using words that I can actually pronounce. And hardcore sexual representation. Why am I laughing? That's not funny. Where was I? Okay.